Ethan Blake trudged through the dense forest, his boots crunching over twigs and fallen leaves. The night was unusually quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. He gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam cutting through the darkness, as he followed the faint trail of smoke curling upward in the distance. Whatever had crashed in the woods wasn't from this world. He stopped at the edge of a shallow crater, his heart pounding. In the center, something metallic and sleek reflected the moonlight. Sparks fizzled from its side, and the faint smell of burnt ozone filled the air. Ethan's military instincts kicked in, but this was unlike anything he'd encountered during his years of service. His eyes scanned the wreckage cautiously. Then he saw her. She emerged from the shadows, her form bathed in the silvery glow of the moon. She was tall and lithe, with skin that shimmered faintly like starlight. Her eyes, large and otherworldly, locked onto him with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. She clutched her side, where a dark, viscous fluid, her blood, seeped through her fingers. Ethan raised his hand slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." The alien girl didn't respond, her glowing eyes narrowing as she took a step back. Her bioluminescent skin flickered, the light patterns shifting rapidly across her body in what Ethan guessed was some kind of emotional display. He kept his distance, not wanting to spook her. "You're hurt," he said, nodding toward her side. "I can help." She hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the surrounding woods. A sudden crackle of static from her ship made her wince, and she stumbled slightly. Instinctively, Ethan moved closer, catching her before she fell. Her skin was warm, almost unnaturally so, and smooth under his calloused hands. She stiffened at his touch, the glowing patterns on her arms flaring brightly. "I've got you," Ethan murmured, his grit steady. "Let's get you out of here." To his surprise, she didn't resist. Whether it was exhaustion or a reluctant trust, she allowed him to guide her away from the wreckage. Together, they made their way through the forest, Ethan supporting her weight as she leaned heavily on him. By the time they reached his cabin, her breathing had grown shallow, and the light in her skin had dimmed significantly. Ethan eased her onto the worn couch, grabbing a first aid kit from the nearby shelf. He wasn't sure if human medical supplies would help her, but he had to try. She watched him warily as he knelt beside her, her eyes following every movement. When he gently peeled back the fabric of her strange, silvery attire to examine the wound, her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "I'm just trying to help," he said, meeting her gaze. "You can trust me." After a tense moment, she released his wrist, her glowing patterns flickering softly, as if in reluctant agreement. Ethan worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying a makeshift bandage. He could feel her eyes on him the entire time, studying him with an intensity that made the air between them feel heavier. When he finished, he sat back, wiping his hands on a towel. "There, that should hold for now." The alien girl remained silent, her breathing steadier but still labored. Ethan grabbed a blanket and draped it over her, noticing how her light seemed to pulse faintly in response. It was mesmerizing, the way her body communicated without words. "What's your name?" he asked, breaking the silence. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, in a voice soft and melodic, she spoke. "Lariah." Ethan nodded. "Lariah. Emithum." She tilted her head slightly, as if testing the sound of his name in her mind. Her glowing eyes softened, and the tension in her posture eased just a fraction. "You're not from around here, obviously," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "Why are you here? What happened?" Mariah's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers tracing patterns on the blanket. The light beneath her skin dimmed, casting faint shadows across her features. "Punishment," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "Punishment? For what?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of pain and defiance in their depths. "I broke the law of my people, defied their rules." Before he could press further, she shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at her injury. Ethan reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against her arm. The contact sent a ripple of light across her skin, the patterns reacting in a way that made her draw in a sharp breath. "Sorry," he said, pulling back. Laria's gaze lingered on him, her glowing eyes searching his face. "Your touch. It's different." Ethan wasn't sure what to say. The moments stretched between them, charged with a strange, unspoken energy. He could feel the weight of her presence, the warmth radiating from her as her bioluminescent patterns slowly calmed. "Get some rest," he said finally, standing up. "We'll figure this out in the morning." Laria nodded faintly, her eyes already growing heavy. As she settled into the couch, her light dimmed further, casting the room into a soft, otherworldly glow. Ethan watched her for a moment, his mind racing. Whoever she was, whatever she'd done, she was now a part of his life, and he had a feeling things were about to get a lot more complicated. The next morning, Ethan woke to the faint hum of machinery. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, realizing the sound was coming from Laria's ship. The faint plume of smoke had died down, but the soft glow of the wreckage was still visible through the trees. He glanced over at the couch, half expecting her to be asleep. Instead, Laria stood near the window, her eyes fixed on the distant ship. The morning light caught the shimmering patterns on her skin, making her seem both fragile and otherworldly. "You shouldn't be moving around," Ethan said, his voice gravelly with sleep. "You're still hurt." Laria turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm stronger than I appear." Ethan got up and crossed the room. "Even so, you need time to heal. You lost a lot of whatever your kind bleeds." He paused, realizing how absurd that sounded. Laria's lips curved slightly, almost a smile, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Before he could say more, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Ethan's body tensed. He held a finger to his lips and motioned for Laria to stay put. She retreated to the shadows as he approached the door and cracked it open. On the other side stood Captain Reynolds, a stern-faced man with a no-nonsense demeanor. Behind him were two armed guards, their expressions as rigid as their postures. "Blake," Reynolds said, his tone brisk. "We got reports of a crash. You see anything unusual out here?" Ethan kept his face neutral. "Yeah, I saw something. Went to check it out last night. Looks like some kind of satellite or drone. Didn't stick around long. Might have been unstable." Reynolds peered past Ethan into the cabin. "Mind if we take a look?" Ethan leaned casually against the doorframe, blocking their view. "Already told you everything. If it's government tech, you'll want to secure it yourselves. Didn't seem safe to poke around." Reynolds frowned but didn't push further. "We'll handle it. Just stay out of the way." As the soldiers moved toward the forest, Ethan closed the door and exhaled. Turning back, he found Laria watching him, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and unease. "They're not your people, are they?" she asked softly. "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "They're human like me, but they don't trust anything or anyone they can't control." Laria nodded, her glowing patterns shifting subtly. "Then we must be careful." For the next few hours they stayed inside, avoiding the patrols combing the woods. Laria seemed restless, her gaze constantly flicking to the window. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan decided it was safe enough to step outside. "You've been cooped up all day," he said. "Let's get some air." They walked together in silence, the crisp evening breeze carrying the scent of pine. Laria seemed to relax, her shoulders loosening as they moved farther from the cabin. Ethan led her to a small clearing where the stars stretched endlessly above them. Laria stopped and tilted her head back, her skin glowing faintly in the starlight. "Your sky is vast," she murmured. "Different from mine." Ethan followed her gaze. "It's one of the few things I've always liked about this place." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Why do you live here, so far from others?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Needed peace and quiet after everything I've been through. Too much noise in the world." Laria studied him, her glowing eyes softening. "You carry pain, Ethan. It lingers in your eyes, in the way you move. Ethan looked away, uncomfortable with how easily she saw through him. We've all got our burdens. She stepped closer, her voice gentle. Mine brought me here. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, Lariah reached out, her fingers brushing against Ethan's hand. Her touch was warm, sending a tingling sensation up his arm. He glanced at her, surprised by the sudden closeness. Your kind, she said softly, does not communicate as mine does, but there is a resonance between us. Ethan's breath hitched as her glowing patterns shifted, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. It was mesmerizing, the way her body seemed to respond to his presence. He felt an unspoken connection building between them, something neither of them fully understood. Lariah's other hand rested lightly on his chest, just over his heart. You are different from what I was told of humans. There is kindness in you. Ethan swallowed hard. You're not what I expected either. They stood there, the space between them shrinking as the connection deepened. Lariah's glowing patterns brightened, casting a soft, ethereal light around them. Slowly, almost tentatively, Ethan raised his hand and brushed a strand of silver hair from her face. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before he could respond, a distant shout shattered the stillness. Both of them froze, their eyes snapping toward the direction of the sound. The soldiers were getting closer. We need to go, Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. Lariah nodded, her glowing patterns dimming as she pulled back. Together, they hurried back toward the cabin, the brief moment of peace already slipping away. As they reached the edge of the forest, Ethan's mind raced. The patrols wouldn't give up easily, and Lariah's presence was too conspicuous to hide forever. Inside the cabin, Ethan locked the door and turned to Lariah. They're not going to stop looking. We'll have to figure out a way to keep you safe. Lariah's gaze was steady, her expression resolute. I trust you. The weight of her words settled on him, and Ethan felt a newfound determination. Whatever it took, he wouldn't let them take her. As night fell, the tension lingered in the air, a silent reminder that their time was running out. Ethan's thoughts turned to the days ahead, knowing they would need more than trust to survive what was coming. The next few days passed in a tense rhythm. Patrols combed the forest with increased frequency, forcing Ethan and Lariah to remain indoors for longer stretches. They communicated in quiet tones, their conversations often breaking into silence as they listened for the distant crunch of boots or the hum of scanning equipment. Despite the danger, their bond deepened. Ethan found himself more attuned to Lariah's subtle shifts in mood, conveyed through the intricate patterns of light that rippled across her skin. She, in turn, seemed fascinated by the roughness of his world, the textures of wood and fabric, the simple mechanics of human tools, and most of all, the steady, unguarded presence of Ethan himself. One evening, as the light outside dimmed to twilight, Ethan sat at the small table, sharpening a hunting knife. Lariah watched him from across the room, her glowing eyes fixed on the rhythmic motion of his hands. She tilted her head, a curious expression crossing her face. Your people use weapons often, she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. Ethan glanced up, giving a half-smile. Out here, it's more for survival than anything else. Hunting, protection. Lariah rose from her seat and crossed the room with graceful steps. She stood beside him, her gaze dropping to the knife in his hand. It is strange to me, she admitted, to see violence tied so closely to life. Ethan set the blade down, his fingers brushing hers as he did. Her skin was warm, the light beneath her surface pulsing faintly at his touch. The brief contact sent a jolt through him, and he noticed how her patterns shifted in response. You said your people don't fight, Ethan said, his voice low. How do you defend yourselves? Lariah hesitated, then slowly placed her hand over his. We don't, she said. Our strength lies in unity, in understanding. Violence is rare, and when it happens, Her voice trailed off, her gaze distant. It breaks us. Ethan watched her, the weight of her words settling in the space between them. He could see the pain she carried, the scars left not on her body but in her spirit. Without thinking, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers gently through hers. Her eyes met his, the soft glow intensifying as she leaned closer. "You're not broken," Ethan said quietly. "Not while you're here." Laria's lips parted slightly, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might pull away. Instead, she moved closer, her free hand rising to rest lightly on his chest. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice a mix of uncertainty and longing. "I don't understand this." He reached up, his hand cupping her face. Her skin was impossibly smooth, the glow beneath it radiating warmth. "This is trust," he said. "And maybe something more." Laria closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The glow of her patterns shifted, becoming slower, more deliberate. It was as if her body was speaking a language of its own, one that transcended words. When her eyes opened again, there was a softness in them that made Ethan's breath catch. "I want to know," she whispered. "Show me." Ethan hesitated, searching her face for any sign of doubt. But Laria's expression was open, her gaze steady. Slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a tentative kiss. Her response was immediate, her light flaring softly as she pressed closer. The warmth of her body, the way she seemed to synchronize with his every movement, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Their kiss deepened, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The dangers, the patrols, the uncertainty of their future. All of it faded into the background. There was only the quiet, unspoken connection between them, growing stronger with each passing second. When they finally pulled apart, Laria rested her forehead against his, her breathing steady but shallow. "Your kind shares so much through touch," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan chuckled softly, his hand still cradling her face. "And yours shares so much through light," he replied. "We're not so different, after all." Laria smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that made her light shimmer. "No," she agreed. "We are not." The sound of distant voices shattered the moment. Ethan's head snapped toward the window, his body tensing. The patrols were closer than ever, their search patterns tightening. He rose quickly, motioning for Laria to follow him. "We can't stay here much longer," he said, his tone urgent. "They'll find us if we don't move." Laria nodded, her glow dimming as she prepared herself. "Where will we go?" Ethan thought for a moment, then grabbed a small pack from the corner of the room. "There's an old network of caves a few miles from here. They're well hidden and hard to navigate. It'll buy us some time." Without another word, they moved swiftly, gathering only the essentials. As they stepped out into the night, the cool air wrapped around them, carrying the faint sounds of the search parties in the distance. Ethan led the way, his hand occasionally brushing against Laria's to reassure her. The journey was tense but uneventful, and by the time they reached the cave entrance, the patrols had grown faint. Ethan guided Laria inside, the darkness enveloping them as they ventured deeper. Once they were safely hidden, he lit a small lantern, its soft glow casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Laria sank onto a flat rock, her light gradually returning as she caught her breath. Ethan sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. For a while, neither of them spoke, the weight of their situation settling heavily in the cool, damp air. Finally, Laria broke the silence. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space, "why do you help me? You risk so much." Ethan turned to her, his expression serious. "Because you deserve more than the life they're trying to take from you. And because I've spent too many years running from things that mattered." Laria reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "You are different," she said again, her glow softening. "And for that, I am grateful." Ethan gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We'll get through this," he said. "Together." As the lantern's flame flickered, casting its light on their intertwined hands, the sense of impending danger lingered. But so did the quiet, growing strength of their bond. The cave offered a fleeting sense of security. Its narrow, twisting tunnels made it nearly impossible for the patrols to follow without detection, and the natural acoustics amplified even the faintest sounds of approaching footsteps. Despite the temporary reprieve, the tension between Ethan and Lariah lingered, not from fear, but from something deeper, more unspoken. As the hours stretched into the evening, Ethan sat near the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond. He hadn't seen or heard any signs of pursuit, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Lariah, meanwhile, sat by the dim lantern, her glowing patterns shifting in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. She was quieter than usual, her gaze fixed on the flickering flame. "You're thinking about them," Ethan said without turning around. Lariah looked up, her expression unreadable. "I always think about them," she admitted. "My people are part of me, even in exile." Ethan finally turned, leaning against the rough stone wall. "Do you miss it? Your home?" Her glow dimmed slightly, the patterns on her skin slowing. "I miss the unity, the connection we shared. But it was that same connection that bound me to their rules, to their expectations." She hesitated, her eyes meeting his. "I couldn't live a life that wasn't truly mine." Ethan nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. "Sometimes walking away is the only way to find yourself." Lariah tilted her head, her light shifting as she studied him. "And you? What did you walk away from?" He hesitated, the question stirring memories he had long buried. "A lot of things," he said finally. "People I cared about, a life that stopped making sense. It was easier to leave than to stay and face what I'd lost." Lariah moved closer, her gaze softening. "You carry your past with you, Ethan. But it doesn't have to define you." For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the weight of their shared confessions settling between them. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Lariah reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his. The warmth of her touch sent a familiar jolt through him, and he felt his pulse quicken. Lariah's glowing patterns began to shift again, this time with a deliberate, almost sensual rhythm. "Your presence, it calms me," she said softly. "And yet, it stirs something unfamiliar." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "Lariah," she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Show me what it means to be human, Ethan. Help me understand." He didn't respond with words. Instead, he closed the small distance between them, his hand finding her face as he pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was slow, exploratory, yet filled with a quiet intensity. Lariah's light flared softly, responding to the rising emotions between them. As the kiss deepened, Ethan's hands moved to her shoulders, tracing the lines of her delicate frame. Lariah shivered under his touch, her glowing patterns shifting in time with his movements. Her hands found their way to his chest, her fingers splaying over the steady thrum of his heartbeat. The air around them seemed to grow warmer, charged with the unspoken connection they shared. Ethan pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. "You feel that?" he murmured. Lariah nodded, her breath hitching. "It's overwhelming, but I don't want it to stop." Ethan smiled, his hands gently cradling her face. "It won't." For a time they stayed like that, lost in each other. The world outside the cave felt distant, the looming threat of discovery momentarily forgotten. All that mattered was the quiet, undeniable bond that had formed between them. Eventually, Lariah pulled back, her glowing eyes searching his. "Ethan, I've never felt this before. It's like our very beings are aligning." Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "It's a connection, Lariah. Something beyond words, beyond logic." She smiled softly, her patterns glowing brighter. "It's beautiful." Their moment of peace was interrupted by a faint, distant sound. Ethan's head snapped toward the entrance, his instincts kicking in. He motioned for Lariah to stay quiet as he moved to the cave's edge, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The sound grew louder, footsteps, deliberate and methodical, echoing faintly through the night. Ethan's heart pounded as he strained to count them. At least 3, maybe more. "They're coming," he said quietly, moving back to Lariah. "We need to be ready." Lariah's glow dimmed, her patterns shifting into a more subdued rhythm. "What will we do?" Ethan considered their options quickly. "If they get too close, we'll have to move deeper into the caves. It'll be harder for them to follow, but we can't risk getting trapped." Lariah nodded, her expression calm despite the tension in the air. "I trust you." Ethan's eyes softened. "I won't let anything happen to you." The footsteps grew louder, their echoes bouncing off the stone walls. Ethan extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. Lariah's glow provided just enough light to see by as they moved quietly through the narrow tunnels. They reached a deeper chamber, the space widening slightly as the air grew cooler. Ethan crouched low, motioning for Lariah to stay close. The footsteps paused, followed by the murmur of voices. "They're searching," Ethan whispered. "Stay quiet." Lariah nodded, her light dimming further as they waited. The tension was palpable, every second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Ethan's hand found Lariah's, their fingers intertwining in a silent gesture of reassurance. The voices grew fainter, the footsteps retreating slowly. Ethan exhaled quietly, his body relaxing slightly. "They're moving on," he said. "For now." Lariah leaned into him, her glow returning to a soft, steady rhythm. "We're safe," she said, though her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. For now, as the quiet of the cave returned, they remained close, their hands still intertwined. The danger was far from over, but for the moment, they found solace in each other's presence. And in the depths of the cave, their bond continued to grow, unshaken by the threats that loomed outside. The patrols didn't return that night, but the tension lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the danger still looming. Ethan kept his watchful eyes on the entrance to the cave, his mind racing with strategies and contingencies. Every passing moment felt like a fragile balance between safety and exposure. Beside him, Lariah sat cross-legged, her bioluminescent glow a steady rhythm of soft light, offering a strange comfort in the oppressive darkness. "You don't sleep much," Lariah said, her voice breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, her tone tinged with quiet concern. Ethan glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Old habit," he replied. "You learn to stay alert in situations like this. Rest isn't always an option." Lariah tilted her head, her eyes reflecting the faint light of her skin. "But you can't protect me if you're exhausted." Her words hung between them, and Ethan knew she was right. He leaned back against the rough cave wall, exhaling slowly. "I'll rest when I can," he said. "But right now, keeping you safe is what matters." Lariah's glow shifted slightly, her patterns slowing into a calm, almost soothing pulse. She moved closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You've done more for me than I could have ever expected," she said softly. "But you don't have to carry this alone." Ethan looked at her, her glowing features illuminated in the dim light. The sincerity in her voice, the quiet strength in her eyes, stirred something deep within him. He reached up, his hand covering hers. "We'll get through this," he said. "Together." Lariah nodded, her gaze unwavering. For a while, they simply sat in silence, their connection unspoken but undeniable. The weight of their circumstances didn't feel as heavy with her beside him. Eventually, Lariah spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "When I was on my world, I always felt confined, trapped by expectations, by rules that dictated every aspect of my life." She looked at Ethan, her patterns shifting into a soft, wistful glow. "But here, with you, I feel free in a way I never thought possible." Ethan's hand tightened slightly on hers. "Freedom's a strange thing," he said. "Sometimes you don't realize how much you need it until it's gone." Lariah leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "And sometimes, You find it in the most unexpected places. The quiet intimacy of the moment was broken by a sudden, faint hum. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his body immediately on alert. Lariah straightened, her glow dimming as she focused on the sound. "It's coming from deeper in the cave," Ethan said, his voice low. He grabbed the small lantern and lit it, the flame casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. "Stay close." Lariah followed him as they moved deeper into the tunnels. The hum grew louder, more rhythmic, reverberating through the stone. It wasn't mechanical. It was something more organic, almost alive. Ethan's grip tightened on the lantern, his senses on high alert. They emerged into a larger chamber, the space illuminated by faintly glowing crystals embedded in the walls. The hum emanated from the crystals, their light pulsing in time with the sound. Lariah's eyes widened as she stepped forward, her patterns shifting in response to the crystal's glow. This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. She reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the crystals. The moment her skin made contact, the hum intensified, and the crystal's glow brightened. Ethan watched, a mixture of fascination and caution. "What's happening?" Lariah turned to him, her expression a mix of wonder and realization. "These crystals resonate with energy," she explained. "They're amplifying the connection between us." As if to demonstrate, she took Ethan's hand and placed it on another crystal. The instant their hands touched the cool surface, a surge of warmth passed between them, and the light from the crystals flared brighter. Ethan felt a strange, almost electric sensation, as though the crystals were amplifying their emotions, their very beings. "It's like they're alive," Ethan said, his voice hushed. Lariah nodded. "In a way they are. They respond to the energy around them, to the bond we share." The light from the crystals cast a soft, ethereal glow around the chamber, highlighting the delicate contours of Lariah's face. Ethan's eyes lingered on her, drawn to the quiet strength and beauty that radiated from her. Slowly, almost instinctively, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Lariah leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as her patterns shifted into a slow, steady rhythm. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer, their connection deepening as the crystals around them pulsed in time with their heartbeats. Lariah's hands rested gently on his chest, her touch sending a warmth through him that was both comforting and exhilarating. Their eyes met, and in that moment, words became unnecessary. Ethan lowered his head, capturing her lips in a tender kiss. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet hum of the crystals and the steady beat of their hearts. Lariah's hands slid up to his shoulders, her fingers curling slightly as she pressed closer. The kiss deepened, their shared connection intensifying as the crystals responded to their emotions. The light around them grew brighter, casting intricate patterns on the cave walls. It was as though the very space around them acknowledged and amplified the bond they shared. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling in the still air. Lariah's eyes opened slowly, her glowing patterns pulsing in time with the lingering warmth of their connection. "I've never felt anything like this," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan smiled, his hands gently cradling her face. "Neither have I." The hum of the crystals began to fade, their glow dimming as the energy in the chamber settled. Lariah stepped back slightly, her hands still intertwined with Ethan's. "These crystals," she said, glancing around the chamber, "they amplify what's already there. They've shown us the strength of our bond." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And they've given us something else, hope." As they made their way back to the entrance of the cave, the weight of their circumstances felt lighter. The connection they had forged, both with each other and with the strange, living crystals, was a reminder that even in the darkest of places, light and hope could be found. But the danger was far from over, and they both knew it. The patrols were still out there, and their time was running out. Yet, for the first time in days, they felt a quiet confidence in the face of the unknown. Together, they would face whatever came next. The next morning, The cave was eerily quiet, save for the faint drip of water echoing through the tunnels. Ethan stirred from a light sleep, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. His eyes adjusted to the dim light of the lantern, now reduced to a soft flicker. Lariah sat nearby, her skin's gentle glow illuminating the space between them. She seemed deep in thought, her gaze fixed on her hands as her bioluminescent patterns pulsed in slow, deliberate waves. Ethan pushed himself upright, wincing as his muscles protested. "You've been awake all night," he said, his voice husky from sleep. Lariah glanced at him, her expression calm but introspective. "I've been thinking," she replied, "about what happens if they find us." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They won't. You can't guarantee that," she said softly. "Your people. They won't stop until I'm either captured or eliminated." Ethan moved closer, his hand resting on hers. "We're not going to let that happen. We'll find a way." Lariah studied his face, her glow shifting subtly under his touch. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." He squeezed her hand gently. "You're not just some burden, Lariah. You're worth fighting for." Her patterns brightened slightly, a flicker of emotion crossing her features. "You risk so much, Ethan. I don't fully understand why." He held her gaze, his voice steady. "Because sometimes, you find something worth holding on to, even when everything else tells you to let go." For a moment, silence filled the space between them, thick with unspoken feelings. Then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, Lariah leaned in, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. They stayed like that for a while, finding comfort in each other's presence despite the looming threat outside. But their fragile peace was shattered by a sudden noise, a faint metallic clatter from deeper within the cave. Ethan tensed immediately, his hand reaching for the knife at his side. He signaled for Lariah to stay quiet, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The sound repeated, louder this time, accompanied by a faint hum that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Lariah's patterns dimmed as she shifted closer, her expression tense. "They're here," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm. They moved cautiously through the tunnels, the flickering lantern casting shifting shadows on the walls. The hum grew steadily louder, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate through the very rock around them. Ethan's grip on the knife tightened as they approached a bend in the tunnel. Peering around the corner, he caught sight of a faint blue light emanating from the deeper chamber. The same chamber with the glowing crystals. The hum originated from there, its intensity growing with each passing second. Lariah's eyes widened as she recognized the energy. "The crystals are reacting," she said, her voice barely audible. "Someone is trying to harness their power." Ethan frowned. "Your people." She shook her head. "No, this is different." They crept closer, keeping to the shadows. As they reached the edge of the chamber, they saw them. 3 figures clad in sleek, dark armor, their faces obscured by helmets. The soldiers moved methodically, placing strange, cylindrical devices around the crystals. Each device emitted a faint glow, pulsing in sync with the hum. "They're setting up some kind of energy field," Lariah murmured, her patterns flickering nervously. "If they succeed, it could disrupt the entire network of crystals." Ethan's mind worked quickly. "What happens if the crystals are disrupted?" "The cave will collapse," she said grimly. "And anyone inside." Ethan didn't need her to finish. His jaw tightened as he assessed the situation. They couldn't afford to wait. If the soldiers completed their setup, the entire cave system, and their only sanctuary, would be destroyed. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and determined. "I'll take care of it." Lariah's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "You can't face them alone." Ethan looked at her, his expression unwavering. "I've dealt with worse. Just trust me." Before she could protest further, he slipped into the chamber, keeping low and moving with practiced stealth. The soldiers were focused on their task, oblivious to his presence. Ethan moved quickly, disabling the first device with a swift, precise strike from his knife. The hum faltered briefly, drawing the soldiers' attention. They turned sharply, their weapons raised as they scanned the chamber. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his breathing steady as he calculated his next move. One of the soldiers approached cautiously, his weapons mounted light cutting through the darkness. As the beam passed over him, Ethan struck, his knife flashing as he disarmed the soldier in a single, fluid motion. The man went down with a muffled grunt, but the noise alerted the others. The remaining two soldiers opened fire, their weapons emitting bright, crackling energy bursts that ricocheted off the cave walls. Ethan ducked behind a large crystal, his mind racing as he searched for an opening. Lariah, watching from the shadows, knew she couldn't stay hidden any longer. Summoning her courage, she stepped into the chamber, her glow intensifying. The sudden burst of light drew the soldiers' attention, momentarily blinding them. Ethan seized the opportunity, emerging from cover to take down the second soldier with a swift, calculated strike. The last soldier hesitated, his weapon aimed at Lariah. "Don't move!" the soldier barked, his voice distorted through the helmet. Lariah raised her hands slowly, her patterns shifting into a calm, deliberate rhythm. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice steady. "If you activate those devices, you'll destroy this place and yourselves." The soldier hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his stance. Ethan, sensing the momentary distraction, closed the distance quickly. Before the soldier could react, Ethan disarmed him, slamming the weapon to the ground. With the immediate threat neutralized, Ethan and Lariah worked together to dismantle the remaining devices. The hum gradually faded, the crystal's glow returning to their natural rhythm. Breathing heavily, Ethan glanced at Lariah. "You okay?" She nodded, her glow steadying. "Thanks to you." As they secured the chamber, the weight of their narrow escape settled in. The patrols wouldn't give up easily, and the stakes had only grown higher. But for now they had each other and a fighting chance. The tension in the cave was almost suffocating as Ethan and Lariah prepared for the next phase of their escape. The soldiers they had subdued were securely tied and unconscious in one of the deeper chambers. But they knew it wouldn't be long before their absence was noticed. The devices meant to destabilize the crystal network lay in a pile at the chamber's center, their faint glow now extinguished. Ethan paced near the cave entrance, his knife spinning idly in his hand. His mind was racing, running through every possible scenario. The soldiers had been well equipped, too well for a standard patrol. This was a specialized unit, sent to either capture or eliminate Lariah, and Ethan knew reinforcements were inevitable. "We need to move," he said, his voice breaking the silence. He turned to Lariah, who stood near the cluster of crystals, her glowing patterns flickering softly. "They'll send more when these guys don't report back." Lariah nodded, but her gaze lingered on the crystals. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice hesitant. "These crystals, they're more than just a natural energy source. They're connected to my people." Ethan frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" "They're a lifeline," she explained, her patterns shifting into a slow, contemplative rhythm. "They amplify and transmit energy, emotions, even memories. If we can harness their power, we might be able to send a signal to call for help." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Wouldn't that also give away our location?" Lariah shook her head. "Not if we mask the signal within the natural pulses of the crystals. It's risky, but it might be our only chance to reach someone who can help." Ethan considered this, his jaw tightening. "How long would it take?" "An hour, maybe less," she said. "But I'll need your help to stabilize the flow." He nodded, already moving to gather the necessary equipment. "Let's do it. We don't have much time." They worked quickly, Lariah guiding Ethan as they arranged the crystal fragments into a precise formation. The chamber hummed with a low, steady energy, the crystals responding to Lariah's touch as she carefully synchronized their pulses. Ethan followed her instructions, his hands steady as he adjusted the positioning of the fragments. As they worked, Ethan couldn't help but admire Lariah's focus. Her glowing patterns shifted in complex rhythms, her entire being attuned to the energy around them. Despite the tension, there was a calm determination in her movements, a quiet strength that inspired confidence. "Almost there," Lariah said, her voice low but steady. "Just a little more." Ethan adjusted the final fragment, and the chamber was suddenly bathed in a soft, radiant light. The hum of the crystals intensified, their pulses synchronizing into a harmonious rhythm. Lariah placed her hands on the central crystal, her eyes closing as she focused. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the crystals flared brightly, their energy coalescing into a focused beam that shot upward, disappearing into the rocky ceiling. The light pulsed steadily, each wave carrying the encoded signal Lariah had crafted. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The signal is sent." Ethan exhaled, stepping back from the formation. "Now we wait." But their relief was short-lived. A sudden, sharp noise echoed from the cave entrance, a metallic clang, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on stone. Ethan's heart sank. They were out of time. "Lariah, get behind me," he said, drawing his knife as he moved toward the entrance. Lariah hesitated for a moment before following his command, her glow dimming as she retreated into the shadows. The soldiers appeared moments later, their weapons raised as they fanned out through the chamber. These were not the standard patrols. They moved with precision, their dark armor glinting in the crystal light. One of them, clearly the leader, stepped forward, his helmeted gaze locking onto Ethan. "Ethan Blake," the man said, his voice distorted through a modulated speaker. "You're harboring an alien fugitive. Surrender her now, and we'll consider sparing your life." Ethan smirked, his grip tightening on the knife. "Funny, I was about to offer you the same deal." The leader's stance shifted, a signal to his team. "Very well," he said. "No more warnings." The soldiers moved in, their weapons discharging bursts of crackling energy. Ethan dodged behind a rock, his instincts kicking in as he calculated his next move. He couldn't take them all head-on, but he didn't need to. He just had to buy time. From her position in the shadows, Lariah watched the battle unfold, her mind racing. She knew Ethan was skilled, but the odds were overwhelming. She had to do something. Her gaze fell on the crystals, their energy still pulsing with residual power from the signal. A plan formed in her mind. She stepped forward, her hands hovering over the central crystal. Her patterns flared brightly as she focused, drawing on the energy around her. The crystal responded, its light intensifying as it fed into her connection. The soldiers hesitated as the chamber filled with a blinding light. Ethan seized the moment, taking down one of the soldiers with a swift strike. But it was Lariah who turned the tide. The energy she had gathered coalesced into a powerful wave, surging outward and knocking the remaining soldiers off their feet. The leader staggered, his weapon falling from his grasp as he stared at Lariah. "What are you?" he muttered. Lariah stepped forward, her glow pulsing with a fierce intensity. "Someone who won't be taken so easily." The leader raised his hands, but before he could react, Ethan moved in, delivering a swift blow that knocked him unconscious. The chamber fell silent once more, the only sound the steady hum of the crystals. Ethan turned to Lariah, his chest rising and falling heavily. "You okay?" She nodded, her glow softening as the energy around her settled. "I'm fine. Are you?" "Better now," he said, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. They both knew the fight wasn't over. More soldiers would come and their time was running out. But for the moment, they had won a crucial victory, and hope was still within reach. The cave was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the fight, save for the faint hum of the crystals, their light pulsing gently as though they, too, were recovering. Ethan stood over the unconscious soldiers, his breathing steady but his body taut with the lingering tension of battle. His grip on the knife loosened slightly as he surveyed the scene. They had won, but the reprieve would be temporary. Lariah stood a few steps behind him, her bioluminescent patterns still glowing faintly from the surge of energy she had wielded. The power within her had calmed, but the intensity of the moment lingered in her eyes. She stepped forward, her light casting soft, shifting shadows on the walls as she approached Ethan. "They'll send more," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Ethan nodded, his gaze shifting to the soldiers tied in the corner. "We need to move. But first—" He knelt beside the leader, pulling off the man's helmet. Beneath it, the soldier's face was pale, his expression slack in unconsciousness. Ethan searched him quickly, pulling a small communication device from his belt. Mariah watched as Ethan stood, studying the device in his hands. "What are you thinking?" "We can use this," Ethan said. "If we disrupt their comms, it'll buy us some time." Mariah nodded, her glow brightening slightly. "Let me help." Together, they worked quickly, dismantling the device and using parts from the soldier's gear to create a makeshift signal jammer. Ethan's hands moved with practiced efficiency, while Mariah's glowing patterns shifted in response to the fluctuating energy around them, guiding him through the process. As they finished, a faint, high-pitched whine emanated from the device. Ethan placed it on the ground, its light flickering as it began to emit a subtle, disruptive pulse. "That should keep them off our trail for a little while," Ethan said, standing and brushing off his hands. He turned to Lariah, his expression softening. "Now we need to figure out where to go." Lariah hesitated, her gaze drifting back to the crystals. "The signal we sent. If anyone from my world received it, they might be on their way." Ethan frowned. "And if they didn't?" Lariah's glow dimmed slightly. "Then we'll have to keep running." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll face that when it comes. For now, let's focus on getting out of here." They packed quickly, gathering only the essentials. As they moved deeper into the cave, the hum of the crystals grew fainter, replaced by the quiet sounds of their footsteps on the rocky floor. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading them farther from the chamber where they had fought. Eventually, they emerged into a narrow canyon, the sky above streaked with the warm hues of dawn. The fresh air was a stark contrast to the stifling confines of the cave, and for a moment, they both paused, taking in the expanse of the landscape before them. "We should head for the forest," Ethan said, nodding toward the dense line of trees in the distance. "It'll give us cover." Lariah agreed, and they set off, moving quickly but cautiously. The terrain was rough, the ground uneven and scattered with loose rocks, but they pressed on, driven by the urgency of their situation. As they reached the edge of the forest, Ethan slowed, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Satisfied that they were alone, he motioned for Lariah to follow. They slipped into the cover of the trees, the dense foliage providing a welcome sense of concealment. They walked in silence for a time, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Eventually, they reached a small clearing, and Ethan stopped, his hand raised to signal a pause. "Let's rest here for a bit," he said, his tone gentle but firm. Lariah nodded, sinking onto a fallen log. Her glow was faint, her patterns slow and subdued. Ethan sat beside her, his gaze lingering on her face. "You okay?" he asked softly. She offered a small smile, her eyes meeting his. "I'm tired, but I'm fine." Ethan reached out, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch sent a comforting wave through her, and her glow brightened slightly in response. "We've been through a lot," he said, "but you're stronger than you know." Lariah leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "And I have you to thank for that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They sat together in the quiet of the forest, finding solace in each other's presence. Despite the danger that still loomed, there was a sense of peace between them, a quiet understanding that needed no words. As the sun rose higher, casting dappled light through the canopy, Ethan's mind turned to the road ahead. They had survived this far, but the challenges they faced were far from over. Yet, as he looked at Lariah, her glow steady and her gaze filled with quiet determination, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "We'll keep moving," he said, his voice firm, "and whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Mariah nodded, her hand tightening slightly around his. Together, with that, they rose, their steps light but resolute as they disappeared deeper into the forest, the path ahead uncertain but filled with hope.